Sample 5 is a straight stitch, half-inch seam allowance with a Hong Kong finish. In a Hong Kong finish, I have a sample here that shows this finished edge with a piece of bias strip. I'm going to show you how to make that. I've done a contrast fabric here just so that you can see it, but you can do it all in muslin. So our pattern here shows two pieces. We have our main body, which we're going to cut two, and then we're going to cut two bias strips. If you remember from your fabric properties assignment, that bias is cut on a 45-degree angle and has a lot of stretch. You don't have to actually find the angle. The grain line is created here so that you can do that. So I've separated my pattern pieces, and I'm going to show you on a contrast piece of fabric exactly how to cut the bias. Because I know from this piece of fabric that I've used, if this is my selvage on this edge, then I know that this grain line has to be parallel to that selvage. You can measure it to be accurate, and you will place it so that it is parallel to your selvage edge. Now this one says to cut two. If you find it easier to cut one and then cut another, go ahead and do that. If not, you can go ahead and you can fold your fabric so that you have enough underneath, and then you can cut two, making sure that you've covered everything. You'll pin that down and you'll cut two pieces. Then you will cut two of these pieces also on the straight grain. My next step is to overlock the outer edges of the two body pieces, leaving the length of one of those edges raw, because that's what we'll stitch together. You're going to place those together, and unlike what the pattern says, you're going to stitch it with a 3/4 inch seam. 3/4 inches. Don't forget to lock at the front and the end of the seam. So I've stitched my 3/4 inch seam and I've pressed it open and flat. I'm going to take my bias strip and I'm going to fold it in half. And you can go ahead and press it if you like, so it's flat. And then I'm going to take it and I am going to pin it to one of my seam allowances. Note that you are not pinning it through the body, only through the seam allowance. So this is the one instance where I will allow you to pin in the direction you are going to sew. You're going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Again, just through the seam allowance edge. I've stitched my bias strip, folded edge, to my seam allowance. Then I'm pressing it outward. And my next step is to fold it over and bend it back again. So you're actually wrapping the bias around that raw edge of seam allowance. You want to make sure when you do that that you cover the stitching here, because what we'll do is we'll turn it over. We'll make sure everything is really straight. I'm going to pin it down. And then I'm going to do something called stitch in a ditch. And to do that, I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch in this groove between the stitch seamed of the bias and of the seam allowance. When I do that, it's going to catch this edge on the stitching. So go ahead, pin it back. You can press it if you'd like to keep it nice and even. And then you're going to stitch in that groove of the seam. And again, we call that stitch in a ditch. So I'm placing my fabric underneath and just finding that groove, and I'm going to stitch it down. As you do it, you're going to feel to make sure that that bias is underneath. Go slow so that you can catch everything. And don't forget to lock your stitch at the end. When you're finished, you'll have a clean finished edge. You've caught the back. You'll do the other side, and that will be your Hong Kong finish. Here's the finished product. You can see the seams are really clean. It's bound nicely. And you're finished.